Roxana, you are going to begin this wonderful evening by reading, I hope.
Because this book begins so wonderfully. So she's going to, if you haven't read it, this is going to set your back of your neck the hair will rise.
All right, so this is, does this work? Can you hear me? Okay, this is the very beginning, so I don't need to tell you anything before I begin. I never thought I'd see you here, Sarah says. Then she adds, but I never thought I'd see you anywhere. They're at the Opera House on the second floor, near the head of the grand staircase. He's facing her, leaning his hips against the railing, hands set lightly on either side. Beyond him, in the high open space of the atrium, hang the glittering crystal chandeliers, frozen starbursts. Below, people move up and down the broad red-carpeted staircase, hurrying but stately. They are mostly over 50. This is the second intermission, and there is only so much time left to meet someone, eat something, drink something, void, before the caped ushers begin playing their little xylophones, the bright, tuneless melodies announcing the last act. She had known him at once. His younger face is still visible within this older one, though this one is creased now, hollowed here, fuller there. The same square shape, same bright brown eyes and wide brow. The same thick, light brown hair, though now not so thick. The same fierce vitality in the gaze. I always thought I'd see you somewhere, he says. He looks directly into her eyes. He'd always done this, looked straight into her, as though she were important. It had always unnerved her. You look just the same. She smiles, but shakes her head. You know what I mean, he says. You do. Your eyes. They had been close at one time. After the last curtain call, the dark-haired soprano, curtsying deeply and charmingly, kissing her fingertips to the audience as plastic-wrapped bouquets thud onto the stage. Before the swirling gold curtain is finally drawn for good, Sarah stands, putting on her jacket. She buttons it as she inches her way across the row of seats to join the slow scrum in the aisle. She glances around for Warren, though he'd told her he was on the other side of the house. Almost as soon as they'd met, the little xylophones had begun their atonal melodies, and they'd had to part. He'd asked her to come out for a drink afterward, but she'd said no. She'd said it would be too late. Actually, it had been too sudden. She couldn't decide in that moment if she wanted to sit across from him again, letting him look into her. He asked for her email address, but he hadn't written it down. She thinks he'll forget it. It's so easy to forget those addresses, which seem in the moment so obvious, so unforgettable. Clara 38 at whatever, but they're also obvious in all their other iterations too. Was it Clara 39 at somewhere else, or Clara B 38? Hers is simple and obvious. She thinks he'll forget it. Now I'm skipping one page. He hadn't forgotten her address. His first message is short. I was glad to see you. She doesn't answer at once. It's the tone that concerns her. He's married. She knows that. What does she want? But she was glad to see him. She's allowed to be a friend. Finally, she writes back, yes, me too. He writes again. He's coming to New York on business next month. Will she meet him for dinner? She thinks about it. The speed of email telescopes time, so that thinking about it for a few hours seems like days. Coming into the city for dinner is complicated for her. She lives in northern Westchester, over an hour away. It really means spending the night. She doesn't like driving home late, alone. her head fumed with wine. But she has a friend with a spare bedroom. She writes back, yes. They meet at the restaurant, a fancy one on the west side. Along the street are big plate glass windows. As Sarah walks along the sidewalk, her little suitcase trundling behind her, she sees him inside. He's at a table in the middle of the room, very upright. His elbows are set elegantly on the table, his hands clasped. He's watching the door. As she comes in, he smiles at her, spreading open both hands in celebration. The restaurant is modern and expensive. The latter is evident from the heightened awareness of everyone in the room, the slightly hostile deference of the head waiter, the attentive, slightly condescending waiters, the sharp, sidelong glances of the diners, the glitter of earrings and bracelets. Along the inner wall, more plate glass windows give onto the kitchen, where chefs in white coats move swiftly, chopping and stirring and slicing among white tile and stainless steel, pots and knives, steam and flame. The kitchen is like a silent movie, the workers framed, frenetic, soundless. Warren stands to greet her, smiling. Thank you, she says, sliding onto the banquette. When he sits down, their faces are close, and he looks directly into her eyes. Unsettled, she speaks to break the silence. I don't think men stand up for women anymore, she says, do they? When we were kids, my father would say to my brother, stand up when your mother comes into the room. Do you remember? No one does that anymore. The culture of our youth, he says, gone. Good riddance, most of it, she says. All those rules. It's good to see you, he says. 30 years, anyway. Nearly 40.
So, Roxana, how does a novel come to you? I mean, this book, its beginning is so precisely calibrated. You were just put down in the middle of something that has already begun to happen, that is going to go on happening. And although I cannot be specific about this, the clues to what is going to be the end of the novel are all there in the beginning, if you look for them later. Did you begin leaving knowing where it was going to go?
I did know the ending, which is unusual for me with a novel. Usually I write a novel because I am troubled by some idea, some subject. With Sparta, it was why were we in Iraq? So there's something that draws me to a subject, and then characters sort of emerge and the characters write the narrative. But with this one, I knew the ending. I was really interested in this question of honor, really. That was what I was writing about. I knew the ending. But the beginning, I know that it looks, if you read the whole book and then you go back to the beginning, you think, oh, she's telling us everything here. I can't tell you why I started it there. It was because I went to this particular production of Tosca, and it was so beautiful and it was so moving that I wanted to put it in a book. And you know very well that writers put things into books that happen in their lives, and it doesn't really, doesn't have to be central. This was not central. And also what happens to Sarah right afterwards, meeting that woman in the lobby of the Met. That happened to me once, and and the people that they see at the restaurant, all those things happened to me, and they weren't central to the book, but there are things that I need to put down. I need to make them into part of the public conversation. I want other people to understand that this is something that happens. This is part of life for me and for you if you read the book. So that opening, when I say everyone is hurrying but stately, almost everyone is over 50, that describes the crowd at the Metropolitan Opera. But it turns out to describe what's happening in this book. But it wasn't, I didn't think about that. I was just being in that space, which I'm sure all of you have been in. And I wanted to describe exactly how it feels, not just those broad, shallow steps with the red carpet and the little xylophones, but also the people who are in that space, what they seem like, what they feel like, who they are, why they're there, and that whole sense of celebration. But it's generational. It's a particular generation that is celebrating this particular art form, which is not of today. It's a 19th century art form. So it stirs up things in us that the rest of the culture is not stirring up. So I wanted to put all of those things into the opening, and I didn't know where it was going.
Well, you've said elsewhere, and I think what you just said reinforces that your novels are character driven. Can you expand a little bit on that? How much do you know about your characters when you start? Do they surprise you as you write? Can you give some examples?
So that's a really good question, and it's very important for a novelist. And I always hold Flaubert as an example in front of me, who describes Emma on one page as having blue eyes and another page as having brown eyes. So that's something we want to avoid.
Copy editor. That's
so,
what
well, no,
editor
you
is
should
for.
know it yourself. You
Yes,
should have a very clear sense of the character and know exactly what she looks like. So when I start writing a book, I do often write little biographies, just want little brief biographies of the characters. So I know where they grew up, what their parents did, what kind of community they lived in, what kind of school they went to. So I have a sense of who they are within the culture, how they will respond to things, so that character will be consistent throughout the book. Not only the color of the eyes, but the way that person responds to education or authority or opera. That's a character whom I know before I start the book. However, do they surprise me? Yes. So in Cost, this is the best example for me. I started writing Cost, and I thought I was going to write this really short, brief. I think all my books are going to be really short, and I'm going to write them really fast. Never has happened yet, but so Cost was going to be this very short, simple book that took place in 2 weeks at a summer house in Maine. 3 generations, the older parents, the woman in her 50s divorced, and her 2 sons in their 20s. And it was just, I was really interested in the idea of being an adult child. So it's the woman in the middle generation and what it's like to be with your parents. And I was sort of interested in the fact of no matter how old you are, if you're with your parents, you can open your mouth and hear a whiny 6-year-old speaking, or a very superior 15-year-old or 21-year-old who can't be bothered. No matter how old you are, no matter how mature you think you are, with your parents, you're always a child. So I was interested in that, but also interested in what it would be like to be the parents. And I think they're in their early 80s, and how it would be there at their daughter's house, and what it's like to be a parent when you are starting to lose your grip on the world. Her father is no longer able to do everything he could. He was a neurosurgeon. Her mother is losing her memory. And do you conceal this from your children? How much do you reveal? How frightening is it? Do you reveal that you're frightened? And so it was, and then the sons in their 20s. And so it's going to be this very small, quiet, domestic book about one family. And it's told in the voices, the interior voices. Also, the woman has a sister. So it's 6 voices. Starts out in the parents, one parent, then the other, then the daughter. Then it goes into the older son, who's on a bus on his way up to meet his mother in Maine and her parents. And he says he knows his mother's going to ask him if he's seen his younger brother, Jack. And he has just seen his younger brother, Jack. And I'm in Stephen's mind as he remembers his visit up to his brother Jack. And he describes the apartment that he goes into. And I realize that Jack is a heroin addict, which transforms the entire book. I have to spend 5 years going to NA meetings and talking to addicts and talking to policemen and doctors. So the whole book was completely blown apart by this realization in Stephen's mind that his brother, and his mother does not know this. No one else in the family knows this besides Stephen. So it changed the shape of the entire book. And that does happen. Characters, when I first wrote Summer Light, which Amanda was my brilliant editor for, I started it out writing what I thought was a short story. And at the end of this story, nothing had really happened. And I realized to my horror that I had written the first chapter of a novel. And so I started writing it, and I told my husband, and he said, well, do you have an outline? And I said, no. Do you think I should have an outline? And he's a lawyer, and he said, well, if I were writing a novel, I would certainly have an outline. And I thought, he's right, I should have an outline. So I said, chapter 1, chapter 2, and none of the characters would do anything that I had set out for them. So I threw away the outline. It was useless.
You're very willful.
Willful, yeah. They do what they want.
Well, actually, this is sort of what I was going to ask you about. This leads very much into what I was going to say next, which is when the novel starts, you, as a reader, feel as if this is going to be Sarah's novel. It's going to be a novel about her and the thing that happens when she sees this guy that she's not seen for so long. And she's going to be the heroine of the story. And then we start to see things from Maura's point of view, more and more. And then there's one scene, then there's more, and there's more, and there's more, until the last part of the book is told almost entirely from his point of view, except for one chapter. And in some ways, he takes the narrative over, and he emerges, to my mind anyway, as the central character in some ways. Am I misreading that? Was this your intention? Or did he just hijack it?
I didn't have any intention. I didn't know what I was doing. It does start out as Sarah's book, and she was the entrance into the book. But his story is more dramatic, so he ends it. So that's what happened. I didn't have a plan.
No plan at all.
No plan.
It just went there.
Yeah.
Because it does really become his. So the novel is called Leaving, and the narrative is largely propelled by two breakups. Early on, when they're in college, Sarah breaks up with Warren, who she's been in love with, and vice versa. And she breaks up with him on the phone from her dorm, and just says to him, I don't think you should come next weekend. It's over. And that's it. Then, years later, right after the scenes you have just read, the grown-up Warren falls in love with Sarah again. I mean, he's never not been in love with her. And he tells his wife, whom he married essentially on the rebound, I guess, that he wants a divorce. And that's another form of, and they both have left something here. And I'm curious about how, do you feel, how would you compare their different ways of leaving a relationship?
It's a really good question. Sarah is really clumsy, and she's a college student. She went to a girls' boarding school or girls' high school, and a girls' college. She really doesn't know how to deal with men. She really doesn't know them very well. And she is a complete klutz at this. She doesn't know what to say. She's horrified at the idea that she's hurting him, wants to break up, and doesn't know how to do it. And Warren's breakup is years and years later, and he's much more conscious of what he owes his wife, how she will feel. He's taken great care with it. And Sarah kind of does it blindfolded, backwards. She just doesn't know how to do it. It's kind of one of the questions in the book, or one of the things that interested me, is there's a quote from Trollope saying that, how should you know who you should marry? It's all you really need is a turn at the waltz in a conservatory, and then that's all you need to know. And in fact, people get married for reasons. I mean, nobody knows how to determine whether or not you should marry somebody. There is no set of rules. There's no way to know. So Sarah doesn't know what she's doing, nor was Warren when he married Janet. And she married the wrong person. He married the wrong person. But I was just sort of exploring the ways of making those choices and then getting out of them.
He says something, or he thinks something in the scene, which I thought was so extraordinary. He doesn't know how to tell Janet, what's wrong without delivering a mortal wound. He wants to execute this marriage without causing pain. And I thought that was such a wonderful description of him. He emerges as the most compassionate, kind person from this novel. I was really struck by him. In fact, well, we're going to get to an adjective that we're going to explore this, I hope. Shakespeare uses the word blood 40 times in the Scottish play. You use the word honor or honorable or dishonorable 15 times. I counted.
Oh my gosh.
This is what it is to have an ebook. You can search for the word. It's great. 15 times in Leaving. So could you talk a bit about the role that honor plays in this novel?
Yeah. So that's so interesting.
We were talking about data earlier. Well, there's data for you.
There's data. Yeah. So it is something that I find interesting. And just as opera, which is a romantic form, and it's really a 19th century form that is based on the idea of passion and the emotions. And honor is something that is not, we live in an age of irony, not in an age of honor. Honor isn't something that's part of social discourse. People don't talk about a code of honor. We don't discuss it, but everybody does have their own personal code of honor. Everybody has a guideline that you would never do that. You would never step outside this. You would never be the kind of person who did that. So we all have our own personal codes. And I mention in the book The Age of Innocence, which is really about honor, and about Newland Archer, who has made a commitment, a sort of an institutional commitment to May, and then he falls in love with Ellen Olenska, but he is persuaded partly by his own sense of honor, but also by the community around him, which kind of circles the wagons and says, you may not change your mind now. You have taken a position, and your honor depends on your carrying it out. And so honor is a very important part of that book. And Horton was asked at one point who her greatest influence was. And she said, well, everyone thinks it's Henry James, but it's not. It's really Nathaniel Hawthorne. So that she was really interested in a code of behavior that was partly personal and partly social, that it was something that the whole community would be bound by, a sense of honor. And as I say, it's not something that's fashionable now, but it really interested me the idea of pursuing the question of how far would you go to protect your sense of honor?
And that's really the core theme in this book is what is honor.
Yeah.
And Falstaff had something to say about that, but we won't go there. The last time that we see Sarah in this book, she's with her family, her daughter Meg and her daughter's family, at the beach, and she's thinking, and she says to herself that the greatest failure in her life had been her failure to listen, specifically to Warren when they were young. I'm just wondering when else has she failed to listen? It's at the end of the scene, her grandson says to her, listen exactly to what I say. And she says, okay, listening. But is she listening? I mean, has she learned to do that? And when has she not?
So again, when Sarah's young, she really is clumsy in terms of relationships with men, with boys. She did not have a great relationship with her father. And she did not have a real sense of intimacy with her family. Her parents are not great at intimacy. So she grows up without that skill, the skill of intimacy. And as you learn in the very beginning, it makes her uncomfortable when someone looks directly into her eyes, when someone treats her as someone who's important. She's timid, she's shy, and she's timid, which makes it hard to listen. So she's anxious when someone else is talking, worried that she should give a different kind of response. So it's really Sarah's inability to listen really has to do with her own sense of anxiety and uncertainty about who she is in the world. So has she learned by the end? I hope so.
Yeah.
I hope so.
But the other thing that's so interesting is that she's so observant. She sees so much. It's as if she has, one sense that isn't working.
Oh, that's interesting. Well, seeing you can do without talking to anybody. You don't have to be in conversation.
Okay, that's it.
So that sort of gives her a safe place from which to perceive the world.
So this novel is so intricately woven. It's really hard to separate all the strands in it and to talk about them. But running through it, there's a couple of other themes beyond honor and listening that I wanted to ask you about. One of them is parents and children. There's a moment when Sarah's having lunch with her daughter, Megan. She says to herself, the older you are, the more important your children are to you. A point that seems completely counterintuitive at first because, aren't babies important to their parents? But of course, they're babies. And it's so true. I mean, as a parent of a grown-up, I can really say that. So could you talk about the different roles there were two extraordinary children, adult children in this book, Meg and Katrina, the daughter, Warren's daughter. And can you talk a little bit about their different roles and their in the book?
So Meg is Sarah's daughter, and she's in her early 40s. Katrina is younger than that. And Katrina is an only child. Meg has a brother. And I really, this is another thing that interests me is adult children, and nobody writes about them. Everybody writes about small children. We all have read that. Difficult teenagers, but what it's like to be the parent of an adult child. Yes, when your children are babies, of course they're the center of your life. You're constantly thinking of them, making sure that they're safe and happy, and it's a delight to be with them. But it never occurs to you that your baby can get along without you. It can't. Your baby depends on you for life. That is no longer the case when your baby is 42. And that shock to you as a parent, realizing that your child can just walk away at any moment and do so without even meaning harm, just that they're busy and you are no longer a part of their life. That's a real shock because your whole life has been built on the fact that you are essential to your child. Turns out you're not, actually. So that requires a huge shift, emotional shift, and it's not something that is written about much either. So that was something I wanted to explore.
The whole number of scenes when Sarah comes to Meg's apartment in New York and feels somehow as if she doesn't quite know how to fit into this family life, and her diffidence about this, which as the parent of an adult child, I can relate. I'll tell you, but I thought that was extraordinarily well done. But talk a little also about Katrina, who is the one who, in a sense, sabotages Warren and Sarah's relationship because she just blows it up. I mean, she blows up Warren's attempts to leave the marriage.
Has everyone read this book? No. Yes, mostly? You have. Okay, good. So we're not revealing anything you don't know. So Katrina is, as I say, she's an only child, and she feels responsible for her mother. And she feels responsible for the protection of this marriage. And she can't, I mean, there are people who can yield and say, okay, I can understand how this marriage didn't work. And there are people who cannot see past it. And Katrina cannot see past this. And Katrina cannot tolerate the idea that her mother's being blamed for something she can't help. And that's what's happening. Warren can't go on with Janet because she is not someone he finds himself compatible with, because Katrina says, you don't think she's smart enough. She isn't smart enough for Warren. And Katrina cannot tolerate the idea that her mother should be mortally wounded for something that she can't help. So Katrina is stuck. And that is how she leads her life. And it's so interesting. People have come up to me afterwards and said, this is my story. My sister is 60. My father is 80. My sister has never spoken to his wife. And I say, give it up. He's 80. How long are you going to do this? And she says, I'm sorry, if she's going to be at the Cape, I'm not coming this summer. And so it's not uncommon. I mean, we all think that we can move past things and get beyond something. But if your parent has been mortally wounded, you may not get past that. You may never get past it.
So Meg, of course, also at the beginning of the novel, we're told that when Sarah's first marriage ended, that Meg wouldn't speak to Sarah. Then she relented. And Katrina doesn't do this. So talk a little, one of the things that I found just overwhelming is that Meg has this horrific medical emergency in which, what is the part that this plays in your great scheme of things? Or is it just life going on or almost not going on? Which is one of the things that I think is extraordinary about this book.
It's just, I didn't have a plan. It was part of, it's what happened.
Because what I love about this novel is that it feels to me, reading it, like life happening. And there are these extraordinarily moving and painful, ragged bits that are not, they're not tidy. They're not symmetrical. They happen because they happen. Mm-hmm. And that's one of the things I think I love about your fiction, that you do that. And not everybody does that, but you do.
The characters, they think up these things.
Could we talk a little bit about art? Sarah is a curator, and there's a whole through line in this book about this exhibition that she's trying to put together. at her small museum and the vicissitudes of that and the art that she looks at and wants to include or not include. Can you talk a little bit about that and her seeing her vision?
Part of this is my great lack in knowing the rest of the what the rest of the world does, and my day jobs have all been in art, galleries, Sotheby's, writing about O'Keeffe. So my connection to the rest of the world is through the world of art. And John Cheevers famously said he used to live on the Upper East Side and in an apartment building, and he said every morning all the men would put on suits and they'd go down in the elevators with their briefcases and they'd go off to offices. And he said, I just was dying to know what they did in those offices. What did they do all day? He would go down to the basement where he had a storage room, and that's where he would write. He would take off his suit and hang it up on a hanger and sit in his underwear and work. But he didn't know, and so he was in the suit with the briefcase. But it's always something that writers have to deal with. Our job has nothing to do with the office or office politics or anything like that. But I do know about museums, and I have worked in museums like this, and I have been involved with exhibitions. And for me, it's a great window. It's a portal into the rest of the world. And so I can move into that world and write about some kind of professional situation with some experience without going out and spending 5 years going to NA meetings. This is easier for me. And also, these subjects are really interesting to me. So learning about Netsky, which was part of the exhibitions committee meeting, was fascinating to me. So who knew that they were made out of mammoth tusks, which was very exciting to know. The English watercolorists, I had never known about them. Bloomsbury, I knew a lot about. So it was a way. The other thing is when you write about a character, he or she has to have a real life. You can't just write about their emotional lives. They have to have a life in the world. So, and Warren was an architect because I have 3 brothers-in-law who are architects. So I know a lot about those offices and how they work and how they think of the way to construct a building, how to think about it, and how to deal with clients. So those were things that were familiar to me, ways to bring Sarah and Warren into the real world in ways that I loved and understood.
I was actually going to ask you about why did you make Warren an architect? So one of the things I love is that, first of all, there are a number of houses, different dwellings in this novel, and they're all wonderfully described and evoked. And he asks very interesting questions of his clients about what kind of life do they want to live in the space. And I thought, aha, well, it wasn't aha, it was just, you just did it. Well, oops.
Well, no, I mean.
Or maybe you didn't. Maybe this was just, fate was working on you, or your subconscious was working on you.
Well, that's, so my husband and I did build a house in Maine with our brother-in-law. And those were the questions he asked us. And they were so he would say things like, how many people do you want at a dinner? Are you going to give dinner parties? And do you want a dining room? And how many people do you want at the table? Because here's how many people can sit. If you have 10 people, here's how big the table has to be. And here's how much space you need from the table to the wall. Because here's how much space you need to push the chair out. So those were incredibly practical questions, but also about our social lives, which were things that I wouldn't have thought of. If he'd said, you're not going to get a dining room in this house, I would have thought, okay, Gus, no dining room then. Thank you, architect. But he was asking questions about the way we lived, which made the house very comfortable once we got into it. So I was interested in that interaction because you can look at some modern houses and think, okay, the architect did not actually know that human beings were going to be in residence here.
That is true.
But this experience was very, very different. It was about comfort and what would make you feel happy.
But Warren is also, of course, thinking about how can we live our life?
Mhm.
How should a life be? I think,
Mhm.
or at least it made me think that. Okay, one last point or question. A great character in this novel, who may be based on a real character in your life, is the dog Bella. Can you talk about the dog Bella, who I adore?
So the dog Bella, years ago, there was a book called The Secret Life of Dogs. Maybe you read it. Elizabeth Marshall Thomas. It's a wonderful book. Elizabeth Thomas lived in Peterborough, New Hampshire, which is where my sister Kathy lives. And Kathy got to know her. I was starstruck. I said, "You know her? You met her?" She said, "Yes, she's a neighbor." And she told Thomas that her sister, me, was a writer. And Thomas said, and she said, and she loves dogs. She loved your book. And Thomas said, "Well, does she write about dogs?" And my sister said, "No, never." And Thomas said, "Well, why not if she's a writer and she loves dogs?" And my sister said to me, "So here's the question. You love dogs. You've had them your whole life. Why don't you write about them?" And I said, "Because I would never want to make a dog into a minor character, because they deserve better than that." So that has been in my mind for about 15 years, that I was going to write a book in which I could make a dog a major character. So that is how Bella came to be.
You did. In Summer Light, there is another animal, good, lovely cat,
Right.
whose tragic end would just blighted me for days afterwards. So
I know, I'm not going to talk about it.
It's a horrible thing. But fortunately, nothing like this happens to
No.
Bella. Do you want to talk about Bella's real life inspiration?
Bella's real life inspiration was a black standard poodle whom I had called Lacey, who was a wonderful dog and died about, I don't know, 10 years ago, I guess. And I now have, I won't say a replacement, but I now have another black standard poodle and Bella, Lacey, was extremely elegant, very sophisticated, would do anything I asked without even being asked. Katie, the new standard poodle, is the naughtiest dog in the world. She will do nothing I ask. In fact, she will deliberately try to avoid doing anything I ask. So she's another black standard poodle, but she's not exactly the model for this.
And she has a rich fantasy life.
She's a very rich fantasy.
Apparently,
Yes.
or so we think. Well, on that note, I think that all of you probably have questions about this novel, and I think you should be allowed to ask them. So ask away, and Roxana will try to answer them.
Be happy to do that.
Okay.
Yeah, there's a question. Yeah.
Oh, I thought someone knew. No.
Yeah.
I loved your questions, by the way. They're great. I wanted to piggyback on one of them about how you felt Warren's sort of, in a way, became more central, because that was my experience too. And it struck me that, of course, he's grappling with what kind of a human being do I want to be, which is the essence of honor versus passion, of course. What kind of a person? And if I can't be that person, I don't want to be, in the end, was his. But it seemed to me, I began to realize that Warren was the one making the choices. Sarah she responded to his choices, or the ones he tried to make. And that was an interesting, because we're told, I'm also a writer, that your protagonist has to be the one to make the choices that drive the plot. But in this case, it was really, he did. And I found that so interesting, that her job as a human being was, how am I going to respond to his choices, or his refusal to choose, I just found that so subtle. Am I making sense?
It's so interesting. I hadn't thought about it in that way. One of the things about this book is that it has aroused very strong feelings. And some people get really angry about the book, I think because it doesn't have a happy ending, but
It had to end up.
it has,
It had
thank
to.
you. But, it does.
Yeah.
But one woman, and this only happens on Zoom, in person, people are very friendly and polite, but on Zoom, people get very stroppy. And this woman said, so why didn't Sarah go up to Boston and confront Janet? Which is
Real Housewives.
I mean,
What she was.
well, I mean, what would that have accomplished? It would have accomplished, anyway, she wouldn't have done it. But in a way, Sarah doesn't have a choice. She can't say to Warren, you must do what I want. He can say, oh, what he's saying is, this is what I will do. And she can't say, you can't do that. All she can do is lead the life that she has. So it is asymmetrical, but
No, I loved it. I mean, I thought it was very different because her choices are not driving the story.
right.
She has to make what she can of his, and that's how she decides who she will be.
Mhm. That's a really good point. Thank you.
So,
I hadn't heard that. Yeah.
okay, you can ask the question next time.
Yeah.
I don't have a question, I have a compliment for you. I hate reading sex scenes, I hate writing sex scenes. You have wonderful sex scenes. I love it, it's just beautiful.
Thank you. Thank you. It's it had to be part of this story.
But it was telling you it was beautiful.
And I always, just the way I have Flaubert's example in my mind of never to forget what color eyes your protagonist have. I remember the fact that John Updike received the award from Harvard one year for writing the worst sex scenes. So I was very, very careful in the way I use that. But it seems to me to be about vulnerability and trust. And that's how your body is feeling. So that's what I was trying to put across. But thank you.
It's a great book, I loved it.
Sorry.
I loved your book.
Oh, thank you so much. Thank you.
I also loved the book.
Thank you.
I was struck that all of the characters are so sympathetic. There's no villain. I wanted not to like Janet. I wanted not to like Kat, but I couldn't because I really could understand exactly where they were coming from. It was so real. And I wanted to ask you if that was a conscious effort on your part or if they just kind of came out that way.
I really think, thank you for saying that. There's some people who cannot stand Kat, so I'm glad that you felt compassion for her. I do think it's one of my tasks to understand every character that I write about. And that I do have to understand Kat. I do feel compassion for Kat because she was trapped. I mean, she put herself in a corner and she couldn't get out of it. But I feel compassion for all of them. So, which is why I'm never going to write about a sociopath because I don't think I could get there. And also there are very, very few of them. That's real life for very, very few people. But most of us are, partly good and partly wrong. And that's what interests me, is discovering how people respond to.
But was it
big
an effort
issues.
for you? Did you have to go back and make them more sympathetic?
No. They were sympathetic from the beginning. Janet is a really good person. She did the very best she could.
It's not her fault.
It's totally not her fault. She's not a villain.
And it's not Kat's fault either.
It's not Kat's fault. Kat is, as I say, she's doing something for her mother and then she gets stuck. I was talking to a friend of mine who is one of the most generous, wonderful people in the world. She comes from a very big family and she said, I got into a situation once with one of my sisters and I didn't speak to her for 2 years. And she said, not that I refused to speak, but I never met her eyes. For something happened between them. And her sister finally came to her and said, will you stop? And she said, I can't. And I think she did in the end, because, as I say, she's one of the great people in the world. But I think that happens. You get stuck in a feeling of anger or resentment, And once you're stuck there, it's very hard to move away from that. So I think that's what happened to Kat. She's not a villain. She's not malicious. She got stuck.
I've got a couple of good questions in the chat, just if that becomes relevant, but whatever you like.
Good.
It was just, are there certain writers who inspire you? And would you share them?
Alice Munro, the great Alice Munro. Yeah. Writing now is Tessa Hadley. I hope you all know her wonderful writing. She's an English novelist. Updike was one of my great heroes. So was Cheever. Edith Wharton, Virginia Woolf, won't surprise you. Tolstoy, Anna Karenina, one of the greatest books ever written. Is that enough? Did you have something else? Yes.
So a couple of people in the chat
Oh, yeah.
have asked some good questions. To what extent do you feel like your protagonists are yourself? And she mentioned particularly female protagonists, but could be any.
Yeah, very definitely they are. And I feel, well, protagonists, but all the characters. I mean, I really feel, as I say, it's my task to feel sympathetic, feel compassion, but also to enter into the minds of these characters. So when I wrote Cost, there are three different generations, and it was my job to become all three generations, to find out what it felt like to be a neurosurgeon who could no longer use his hands in any very useful way, and to be a woman in her 80s who's losing her memory and is so frightened by that, and how it would feel to start letting go of words, of being unable. So those, I feel, not just protagonists, but every character in the book that I engage with, I feel it's my role to understand them and to become them while I'm writing them, including Bella.
Another question mentions that this novel reminded them of the ending of The Transit of Venus by Shirley Hazzard, and wondered if Hazzard is an influence on you particularly, or is that novel?
Absolutely, and Amanda
I thought about that.
was Shirley Hazzard's editor. Yes, Shirley Hazzard, I should have mentioned. She's a wonderful writer, great influence on me. And somebody else wrote to me just online and said that this book reminded her of Transit of Venus, which is a great, great honor to me.
I had, as I was reading, I was kind of fastening my seatbelt, getting preparatorily ready to pull out the Kleenex box, because I really thought I saw where this novel was setting, and it felt like Transit of Venus at the time.
So yes, big influence.
Yeah.
Good catch.
Anything else? Other questions? Or are we finished? You have all the most
there's
important
one.
books. There's another.
I also love the book.
Thank you.
And I've recommended it to a lot of people. And I found that when I'm recommending it to people, I kind of struggle to say what it's about, because I felt like there were so many different profound elements in it. And I probably perceived some of them more than others as a daughter, as someone who doesn't have children. But I was wondering what you would say it was about if people ask you.
It is so hard for me to answer that question. And people, at cocktail parties say, "Oh, you're a writer." And I say, "Yeah." So what's your latest book about? Honestly, it is impossible for me to describe it. It took me 350 pages to state it. And it's about all these different things in my head that if you say it's about honor, nobody would open it. Commercial response to the book, but it's about, yeah.
Not like that.
I don't know, sorry.
I think we might have time for one more question, if there is one. And if there isn't,
What are you both reading now that you love and would love to recommend to us? New or old?
So I'm reading Annie Ernaux, the French writer who won the Nobel Prize, and I hope you have all read her books. She is so wonderful. Her books are sometimes called novels. They really read like memoir, and they're very slim and they're so candid and so much. I read the one about her father and then the one about her mother, and talk about generations, and a really deep and very intense and very honest description of what it's like to be a child and how to see your parents, to understand their place in the world and your relationship to them. They're heartrending. So I hope you all read her.
And I'm reading The Heaven and Earth grocery store, along with everybody else though.
So thank you all for coming. Thank you, Society.